Joining me, ladies and gentlemen, via Skype is near-death experiencer Jessica Sawyer. Jessica, welcome to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, and I understand that your experience was transcendental, and I also understand that there was a lot of information received from it. But why don't you give us a little introduction on your childhood history in regards to what you may have learned or practiced in terms of religion and or spirituality, if any?
Absolutely. So I was raised Catholic. I came from a very Catholic family. Went through all of the sacraments up to marriage. So I think the next sacrament would be death, ironically. I don't necessarily identify as Catholic anymore, but it was a big part of my childhood. So we had Catholic school, which was either every Sunday or every Wednesday. And, growing up, religion is culture. I wanted to believe, I wanted to be part of that culture. But I think I remember one of my first times where I really questioned what I was being taught was in a Sunday school class. We were told that animals don't go to heaven. And I think I was like 10, maybe. And I remember raising my hand and said, well, I don't want to go to heaven if there's no animals there. And kind of being like the way that the room felt after I said that was like, oh, that girl's weird. Like she doesn't, want to go to heaven. But that was really kind of the first time I thought, maybe they're wrong, because I can't imagine anything that I would want more than to be with animals when I die. And if animals, this was kind of back then, I think our recent Pope has kind of said, oh, animals do go to heaven. I'm not really sure. I don't really follow it too closely anymore. But I do remember thinking, maybe this isn't the full picture. Maybe this isn't really what's happening. So religion was kind of more of a cultural thing for me. I appreciated it. I loved the Catholic traditions. But for me, I wasn't as gung-ho, I guess. When I lost my best friend, so Anthony, he died very suddenly and unexpectedly. I consider him my brother. I thought God cannot exist if it hurts this much to lose somebody. So God didn't exist. Grief was painful. Grief was awful. And there was nothing that could give me any kind of comfort or solace as far as religion went. It was really easy for me just to kind of be like, well, that's it. There's nothing. And at the time I was married too. And I remember my husband being kind of like, ooh, Jesse, like Anthony was also his brother, best friend. So both of us are grieving very differently, very intensely. And it's very hard when you have a partner and both of you lose somebody. Your grief is different. It's very hard to support one another. But we did it. We both, as much as we could, we supported each other. So I basically went from being a Catholic to being an atheist. It was easy for me. It was just like, I had a biology background from school. So not that science negates spirituality, because I don't believe that at all. But it did kind of open my eyes to, there has to be something else. And religion is not giving me the answers that I seek. And when Anthony died, it was just really easy to be like, well, that's it. There is no God, because if there was a God, if there was a heaven, then grief wouldn't hurt this bad. And it was 2 years later that I had my NDE. So mind-blowing.
Wow, just fascinating how one transitions from a religion as a child, although you questioned Catholicism in terms of whether animals have the same fate as humans after death. But what nailed religion for you was the passing of a close counterpart, which then sends you into atheism. But then comes your near-death experience. Why don't you tell us exactly how your near-death experience came about?
Ooh, so yeah, I was about 30 years old. So I was having some serious issues with like my reproductive organs. And, I started off just going to like my primary care doctor, and she did some basic tests, and she said, I don't know, this is kind of beyond my scope. You need to see a specialist. So I went to an OBGYN, and he was looking at it, and he's like, I think I had about 9 months of different types of tests, different types of like minor, like little surgical procedures. During that time, I also saw a gynecological oncologist. So I had dropped, like, in the span of 9 months, I had dropped about 30 pounds. I was covered in bruises. I would bleed kind of from my gums. I was bleeding from my reproductive area. It was very, very scary not knowing what was happening. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. I did have some interesting blood tests come back a couple of times, but it still didn't explain to them what was happening. And because my symptoms kept getting worse, we got to a point where, my gynecologist and I both agreed, we need to open me up. We need to get my uterus out and look at it. Their thoughts were that some kind of cancer was happening. But at no point during any of that did I think, this was life or death. For me, it was, we need to figure out what's wrong so I can get treatment so I can get better. And a hysterectomy was part of that. And so I had my hysterectomy in May of 2013. And they did a biopsy on my uterus, and they did biopsies on my ovaries, and all the biopsy results came back fine. So again, we were kind of like, everything is still looking okay. Let's just see if your symptoms improve now after this. So after 2 nights in the hospital, I got sent home to finish my recovery. And I remember being in the recliner that was in our bedroom, and it was probably about midnight. I'd been home maybe 8 hours, and then this most excruciating pain just shot through me, and I ended up on the floor like screaming. And I had been taking my pain medications too, and it was not helping. So went to the ER, and they did a scan in the emergency room, and what they found out is that I had internal bleeding. So my abdominal cavity was filling up with blood. So I was readmitted to the hospital. I remember being wheeled in, and one of the nurses that had taken care of me after my surgery, we passed her in the hallway, and I remember her just eyes welling up with tears, and she hugged me and said, "I'm so sorry that you're back here." The bleeding didn't stop. I was filling up with blood. So it was during that time when one night, my blood levels, I was so low, I was so weak. And it was one night, and I just remember staring at the wall across from my bed, and I could hear all the sounds in the room, all the machines I was hooked up to. And it felt like, and this is like the best way I can describe how it felt to leave my body, but it felt like my eyes just opened up somewhere else. So I was staring at the wall. It was like my eyes were open, and then they opened again. And when they opened again, I was in this, like, just, it's an endless, misty white space. Kind of, it didn't feel like a room, but it felt like a place. And the very first thing I noticed was I had no pain. Like, I was zero pain. I felt like I was able to stand up, even though this gets a little kind of muddy, because when you're out of your body, you don't have the body that you're used to. But there is a type of form or a shape kind of like I had some spatial awareness. I kind of do remember feeling I was barefoot. I remember kind of feeling like I had this white energy, or maybe even like just a gown or a swirling, I don't know, like a concentration of just my energy, I guess. And in this white space, I saw Anthony kind of in the distance. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it's Anthony. I want to run up to him. I want to hug him. I want to tell him how much we miss him. I want to tell him about everything that's been going on since he died. And he kind of just like, this is kind of weird too, because we didn't walk or run towards each other. It's like he was here and I was here, and then all of a sudden we were here. There was a movement, but it wasn't like movement or anything that we're used to on this earth. And so we were communicating, but we weren't communicating like you and I are communicating right now. It was a lot of what most people would call telepathy. And maybe that is what telepathy is like. But so the communication that was happening, Anthony put his right hand on my left shoulder and kind of stopped the hug that I wanted to give him. And I was like, why would he stop my hug? And then I was like, oh, this is serious. This isn't some happy reunion, like something serious is happening. And Anthony was just smiling. He was so happy, and he was perfection. And that's when the light appeared. It kind of came out from behind Anthony. It was off to the right. And again, it started off small, but all of a sudden it was just right there. And I get chills every time I talk about the light. Like it's just a somatic response that my body does, but it's kind of cool to me that it still happens after all these years. The light is what many people would call God. The light is known by many names. It is everything that ever was and ever will be. It is unconditional love. And a type of communication did begin to happen between me and the light. I realized that I was dying. This was death. I was ready to go too. This was home. I remember wanting to look back at my body, because at that point I was aware that I was not in my body anymore. And I was kind of told by the light that that's not who you are. You know, so my need to turn around and look at my body lying in the hospital bed, dissipated just by that's not who you are. You know, that kind of stood out to me. And I ended up having a life review, which is kind of, a lot of people will describe it as like a movie scene playing out of your life. For me, it was more of the energy that I'd put out in the world, like up to that point in my life. So how my actions affected others. I could feel how others viewed me, how I impacted the world around me, and I felt it from those perspectives. So it was kind of like an objective review of a subjective human experience. It was just like, here's what you did. For what most religion would say would be sins, this was interesting. What most religion would say would, because I'm technically a sinner by religious standards. They were not viewed as sins at all. I was told that sins really wasn't even a word that was used during our conversation, but the biggest part of life is don't cause intentional harm to another. So, and by intentional harm, it's, you know that what you're about to do is going to hurt the other person, and you're doing it for your own gain in whatever way that is. And that'll look different for many people. But I guess in my life review because I had not done that, or at least not done that to the degree that it would have. I didn't experience any kind of negative feedback from my life review. Some people do. Some people will feel like, oh, I wasn't really that great in this situation. And when they come back, they make amends in some way. For me, it wasn't quite like that. I was told that I had lived life well because I had loved. And I was like, okay, well, then I'm ready to go. Like, I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to join you. And then my life review switched to something that I haven't really heard a lot of NDEers talk about. I was shown future events, not future world events, but how my death would impact specifically my children and my husband. And I saw their futures from that perspective. Now, I'm not really a person who's like, oh, the future is set in stone. It's a predestined plan. I kind of, otherwise, what would be the point of free will? I kind of feel like this was just kind of an outline. If you choose to die, if you stay, this is how it will affect those around you. And still, even knowing their grief, seeing their futures play out, knowing how horrifically it would have been for my husband specifically, I still wanted to stay with the light. Because in the end, the light told me, when it's their time, they will understand. They'll understand everything as you understand everything. And I think it was kind of just granting permission for me to kind of cut those ties or those bonds a little bit. Not that I would have completely cut myself off from them, but, as any parent or caregiver, we want to stay for our children. It's unimaginable that as a mother that I would have wanted to stay with the light. That was one of the hardest things for me to reconcile when I came back, that I wanted to stay with the light. But I think that speaks to how powerful that love is and how powerful our own personal eternal connections are to that light, that we are all extensions of it, all of us. And in a way, we all belong there very strongly. And somehow we kind of forget that when we're here on Earth. Not sure why. I have some theories, but I think we're supposed to. And then when we rejoin, it's just so powerful to be back in what feels like your true natural state. And then to feel like, this is the reality. This is where we all came from. It's where we all go back. And, one day my husband and my kids will be with me. And I was also told that it wouldn't seem as long for me as it would for them. So it would be a lifetime for them without me. There's no time on the other side. It would be like mere seconds. I mean, I would probably just have to wait just a couple of minutes and then my husband and my children would have joined. But for them, they would have lived an entire life without me. And that was another thing that's very fascinating to me, is the time. I've heard a lot of other NDEers say, there's no time, or time it's just not the same as it is here. So that was kind of the part when I was feeling the future. What I wanted to do is I turned and looked down at my husband, who is sleeping on the fold-out couch in the hospital room with me. And I kind of wanted to bargain with the light and Anthony. I said, I just want to float down there and hug him and tell him where I'm going to be and tell him that everything's going to be okay. In some way, I wanted to ease some of the grief that I felt from him, would be his future grief. And I felt like if I just can tell him all of this, it won't be so bad for him. And when I said that to the light, or, just kind of thought it, Anthony smiled at me and squeezed my shoulder. And that's when, he and the light just kind of started fading back. And at the same time they're fading back, I start falling backwards into my body. It's like jumping into an ice cold pool. That's hard. Like leaving my body was easy. No pain. Like that was easy. So dying, I guess, is easy. Going back into my body it's a shock. You're going back into a human, physical, biological body that is breaking down in extreme pain. And I remember kind of like taking a huge breath and like, oh, like that sucked. So I didn't tell anybody at first, because you don't tell anybody first, especially when you're in the hospital. I didn't tell anybody at first that happened, but about 12 hours later, I started expelling all of the blood that had been like pooling inside of me. I looked like I was 5 months pregnant. Like my stomach was so full of blood that it was pushed out. And blood just started pouring out of me just suddenly. My hospital room looked like a horrible murder scene. There was blood everywhere. Nurses were running all over the place. And it was like just someone had turned on a hose. And I remember thinking in that moment, crap, this is it. This is when I'm going to die. And I haven't even told my husband where they gave me the chance. I ruined my chance. I blew my 12-hour window to tell him where I was going to be, because now I'm dying. And what the doctors found out is that my levels actually began to stabilize. So they're watching this blood being expelled from me, but my hematocrit was improving, my blood pressure was improving, my heart rate was going back to normal. It was kind of fascinating to watch. What had happened, I guess, is I had like one of my internal stitches kind of opened up, and it allowed for all that blood to expel, and then it allowed for the healing to begin. Whether that's a miraculous healing or not, I don't know. Maybe.
Well, many people who return from near-death experiences after having a physical trauma or illness do observe how mysteriously and quickly they heal from such injuries and illnesses. It would appear as if the common theme is that near-death experiences did indeed play a role.
Yes. It would be very interesting from a research perspective to look into that. Not really sure how that would happen, but I have heard of these miraculous healings. It very well could have been. It also could have been that, let's say I didn't have the near-death experience, and that still might have happened. But to me, there's a meaning behind that. I do feel like it was miraculous. I have not had any symptoms similar to the symptoms that put me in that situation in the first place. It's been 8 years since my NDE, and I haven't had a symptom again. So we don't know what was wrong with me in the first place, but I haven't had anything come up since. And it also could have been the hysterectomy. Who knows?
Speaking of miracles, many near-death experiencers also mention how they return with things such as precognition, a sixth sense, perhaps stronger empathy, gifts, if you would. Did you notice any of the such upon your return?
Yes. Yeah. This is going to be the fun part for me to talk about, because I'm still figuring these out. 8 years later, there's NDE integration is very difficult. I didn't know anything about near-death experiences after I had mine. I think I ended up, when I was recovering from this at home, I was kind of on bed rest for a little while because we weren't sure what was going to happen. And I think I remember Googling seeing a bright light in the hospital, because I didn't even know what to call it. And that's how I found out that this was a near-death experience. And I was like, oh my gosh, no way, because I don't believe in these things. I was a very science-oriented person. I didn't believe it. I thought near-death experiences were hallucinations or, products from different medications, just the natural process of dying. And to have experienced it, and now I know, no, there is something more happening. It led me on a totally different path. So these after effects can range from just a loss of fear of death all the way to precognitions. deep empathy. Yes, I do not fear death. I have a very deep empathy. I used to not really like humans so much. I was more of an animal person. But I did go back to school, and I changed when I healed. I went back to school and I changed my major from biology to psychology because I wanted to understand humans better. So I think that kind of showed that I definitely had a change. Another thing that I felt very strongly was my love and my connection for everybody around me. It was very intense. I didn't look at people the same way I used to. And I didn't have any control over that. It was just, and it's still very strong to this day. When I'm out walking around, just even virtual strangers, I feel very deeply connected to everybody, and not just persons, but to everything. That's a very strong feeling, and it is kind of hard to get used to at first. It can be very overwhelming. Yes, I have had precognitions. I affect electricity. I'm very surprised my computer has held out this long. And what's really amazing about these after effects, especially with the electricity, especially with the precognitions, I can feel other people's emotions. Even if they're on the other side of the world, sometimes I'll feel like I really need to call this person. Something has happened. And, I'll touch base, and yeah, something definitely happened. But what's really neat about some of them is that I've gotten to a point now where I can tell the difference between what I'm getting as what I call feelings versus kind of maybe my own internal, experiences. So I can tell the difference between them. And when I feel something very strongly, I'll actually tell my husband, hey, I'm getting this feeling right now at this time. It's about this that will happen in the future. I'm telling you so that when it does happen, I know that I'm not crazy. Also, precognitions are not as fun as they sound. It's not my job to tell people what's going to happen to them. How can you tell somebody that you have seen their death, which I have with some people? It's not an easy thing to do. So it's what to do with that information that you get, whether you are a very intuitive person or you're a near-death experiencer who's just now addressing these. It can feel like it's your job to stop something from happening. And what I've learned is it's not. Sometimes you really can't stop things from happening. They're going to play out the way that they're going to play out. But you can do things to make the time that you have with that person meaningful, valuable. In no way would I ever tell anybody anything that was going to be hurtful or scary for them. But knowing those things, I can make the time that they have, and it's not always death that I can predict, but the time that they have with you and in the world, just that much more valuable.
And I can only imagine how scary that is for you, but also how terrifying it is for others if you were to share such sensitive information with them. Final question. What would you say to those who, like yourself, may have trouble believing that there is purpose or that there is something somewhere else looking after this realm?
You are loved beyond imagination. Just as you are right now. Just as who you are right now. You're unconditionally, unimaginably loved. As far as religion now, I believe in all religions and none of them at the same time. I actually find it very fascinating to study different religions and different cultures, and it's how we make meaning in this life. I mean, we're all searching for that. We're all searching for that connection. And in whatever way that brings you that connection, even through atheism, if you feel like you're doing good works here in the world, that's enough. And you're enough as you are.
Well said, and I think near-death experiencers can totally understand that, as well as near-death experience enthusiasts, such as myself, who received the information directly from experiencers such as yourself. Well, Jessica, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your gut-wrenching account here on Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jessica Sawyer.